watching this video, it's probably because you're about ready to go onto the mission field, go on a trip, or you're seriously considering going on a missions trip. We are big fans of people going on overseas missions trips, and we are very excited that you are considering that. As you approach the time to go on a trip, there are a variety of lessons that we think are really important for you to know and embrace. And of those, there's one that kind of rises to the top that I want to kind of really unpack, and that's the idea of having a missional mindset. And the word missional is kind of a buzzword in the church world today, in evangelical circles. It's a word we throw around quite a bit, the idea of being missional, where we want to challenge people to be more missionally minded in their lifestyles. But I really want to take a few moments to really examine what that really means, and particularly how does it impact us as we go on short-term mission trips. The idea of being missional simply points to the fact that I am willing to have my mission be the top priority. As we examine the scriptures, we come upon a passage from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He's writing a letter to a church in Corinth. They had all kinds of problems, and at the root of all of those problems was selfishness. As you know, the first several chapters of the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul is addressing a bunch of different squabbles and issues that had been coming up in the church. But if you really examine each issue, there's kind of one overarching problem. And that's the fact that the Corinthian Christians had made their own convenience more important than the mission that Paul had given them. They figured it was more important to get what they wanted than to accomplish the mission of preaching the gospel and glorifying God in all they do. And so as you look through the book of Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is challenging them to really change their viewpoints. And he comes to a passage that I want to read to you that I think is extremely important and applies to us in our everyday lives, and particularly applies to us as we approach short-term mission trips. 1 Corinthians 9:19, Paul says this: "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible." Paul makes it clear, I believe the gospel. The grace of God gives me absolute freedom. Later in the book, he'll say something to the effect of, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. I am permitted by God to live my life as free as I want. However, it's not necessarily to the benefit of all those that God has called me to reach and to minister to if I live my life however I want. I may be permitted to do it. I've got freedom, as Paul says. I'm free. I don't belong to anyone. But I've made myself a slave to everyone. And the motivation that Paul gives here is the fact that he wants to win people. He says this in verse 20. He says, "To the Jews I become like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law." He's saying, listen, if you're Jewish, I became like a Jewish person because I want to win that Jewish person. If someone is living under the law, I lived as if I was under the law when I was with them, so that I could win them. And if I'm living with someone who's living as if they're not under the law, the ceremonial Jewish law that is, I'm going to live my life as if I myself was not under the ceremonial Jewish law, so that they too can understand the gospel through the life I was living with them. He says this later: "To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some." And he finishes the passage by saying this: "I do all this for the sake of the gospel." Being missionally minded is the idea that I take what I want and what's convenient for me and what's important to me, and I make that secondary, so that the mission of God that's in my life, the mission of God that's been put in front of me by God himself, can be accomplished, and that nothing can get in the way. How does this apply to short-term mission trips in 21st century? I'll give you a few simple examples. Just like the Apostle Paul, when he was in Corinth, there were a variety of people that didn't do certain things. One of the biggest examples he gives throughout some of his other letters is eating certain meats. If you know anything about first century culture, particularly in the Roman Empire, there were certain regions where certain meats, certain foods were sacrificed to idols. Certain foods were typically known to be the type of food that you would take into the temple and you would sacrifice to the pagan gods. Well, a lot of people whether they be Jewish or Christian or otherwise, if they didn't believe in that particular God, they felt uncomfortable eating that particular type of meat. They felt that if you ate that meat at the table, if it had been sacrificed to a pagan god, or if it was correlated with a pagan god, they felt as if they were violating their own religious convictions. Therefore, they felt bad. They felt guilty about eating that type of meat. We know that there's no meat that's sacred or not sacred. There's no meat that's secular or not secular. There's no meat that is pagan or not pagan. All meat is just meat. And the gospel gives us freedom to eat any meat we want. However, if I want to share the gospel with someone who feels like that meat is inappropriate, I'm not going to sit and eat that meat in front of them and offend them or make them feel uncomfortable, because I believe the gospel and my opportunity to share the gospel with that person is way more important than my freedom to enjoy that piece of meat. Now, that may seem sort of silly or almost seem ambiguous to those of us who live in the 21st century, but there are some real-life examples today that apply to us. Let me give you a few of those. If we take a short-term mission trip, let's say to the nation of India, Indian people, regardless of their religious background, whether they be Hindu, Buddhist, or in some cases Christian or Muslim, they believe it's inappropriate for women to wear certain clothing that those of us here, maybe in North America or in the Western world, would not find inappropriate. What we believe is modest and what they believe is modest is very different. Therefore, we don't want to use Western or American standards of modesty to determine what we wear when we're in India. That's why if you take a short-term mission trip to the nation of India, we would have all of our girls wear Punjabis or Saudis. They would not wear American T-shirts and jeans or American clothing. Even if you think that clothing is incredibly modest, even if you are the most modest one in your church or your youth group, if you go to the nation of India, you would be considered incredibly immodest. And therefore, it would only be appropriate for you to wear a Punjabi or Saudi. We believe you have the freedom to whatever you want. We believe that you are not sinning if you don't wear a Punjabi. However, if we go to the nation of India, when we walk there, the people there would not respect us if the women in our group, and our team, were not wearing the clothing that they would want us to wear. And therefore, we sacrifice our convenience, and we sacrifice what we want, and what we believe is best for the betterment of those. To those who live in India, we become like someone who lives in India so that we can win some of the Indians. Another good example is not too long ago, I was in South Africa. And in some of the cities I was in, some of the regions I was in, they believe it's inappropriate for men to wear shorts. Now, it was close to 100 degrees when I was there. I was sweating. And I was thinking to myself, I'd really like to be wearing a pair of shorts right now. But the reality is I know that I can't share the gospel if someone there. I know that I'm not going to get the respect that I need to be able to share the gospel freely. And so I chose to give up my convenience and to wear pants that day, even though it was 100 degrees in the nation, in the part of South Africa I was at. And I think so oftentimes I think this makes sense to us in a lot of different ways. But I think it goes even deeper than that. Let me give you another great example where this might apply. Let's say you're a leader on a trip, and you have an opportunity to do something that might convenience you. I actually know of a great story of a friend of mine who was on a mission trip, and he walks into a room, and he kind of quickly surveys the fact that the room's going to have spots for about 8 people, and he recognized that on his missions team, there's about 8 people. There's 8 people on his team, and he's going to need, by the time they have their sleeping bags out, they're going to recognize that, about every spot of this room is going to be full, about every inch of the room is going to be full. And all of a sudden, he looks over to the room, and he realizes in the corner of the room that there's actually a drip coming. And he quickly kind of realizes that at some point in this trip, it's probably going to rain, and someone on his team is going to have to sleep in the spot where there's a puddle. Well, he doesn't want to be the one who's sleeping in the puddle, so he goes to the other side of the room, and he quickly sets up his sleeping bag and sets up his stuff. The next guy walks in the room and does the exact same thing. You can tell the wheels are turning in his head, and he surveys the room, and he does the exact same thing. And my friend is telling me the story. He's watching the other leader on the trip do this. And the leader looks, and he watches this leader go right to where the puddle is, and he sets his sleeping bag up right in that puddle. And my friend is watching this, and his heart broke because he realized in the moment that he had put himself above the rest of his team. In that moment, he realized that I put my convenience and myself above everyone else. He says, as the leader of the trip, his mission is to make sure that his missionaries, the people on his team, have a great experience. And the reality is that he, as the leader, should have been the first one to put his sleeping bag in that puddle. It may seem simple or silly in some cases, but let me tell you, 4 or 5 days into that trip when it's raining and that one member on your team is having a miserable experience because they're sleeping in a puddle or it's dripping on them, that was an opportunity where my friend had to be missional and he chose not to be. And I remember he telling me, watching someone else be missional, it really inspired him to be missional. So it applies to us, in cultural sensitivity, and the idea that we want to be sensitive to cultures, things like what we wear and how we correspond. And it's things like, hey, I want to take my convenience and make it secondary. The idea of being missional that the Apostle Paul is really outlining for us in 1 Corinthians 9 is the idea that I'm going to take whatever's important to me, whatever makes my experience more convenient, and I'm going to make that secondary to the experience of others. I'm going to make that secondary so that others can have a great experience on the trip, so that others can have the opportunity to share the gospel, and so that others can have the opportunity to hear the gospel. I don't want anything to get in the way of the gospel being portrayed, whether that means someone in another culture not willing to listen to us because of something we've done, or that means someone that I am with not having an experience that makes it conducive for them to share the gospel effectively. There's a bunch of different things that we can do to be missional. Whether it be being willing to sacrifice of ourselves, whether we want to sacrifice of our own convenience, our own freedom, our own money, our own rights, our own energy, our own sleep. There's a bunch of different things that over the course of a short-term mission trip that you're going to have the opportunity to sacrifice, and the choice at that point will be yours. And those are the opportunities we have to say, I'm going to choose to be missional and sacrifice this, or I'm going to choose to indulge in what's convenient for me. If you choose to indulge in what's convenient for you, you'll feel better in the moment. I promise you will. You'll be more excited. You'll feel better. You maybe get some more sleep. But I promise that if you choose to sacrifice what's convenient for you and what you think is best for you, that in that moment, it'll be harder and won't feel good. But there will be an opportunity. There will be a moment down the road, whether it be a few days down the road or maybe months or years down the road, that an opportunity to portray the gospel, to demonstrate the gospel, will come forth in a greater fashion, and the gospel will be made more beautiful because you chose to inconvenience yourself. That's what being missional is really all about. Not just being culturally sensitive, not about choosing to eat something or not eat something, and not even really about being a good leader or not a good leader, or having a good experience or not having a good experience. Being missional is about understanding that the gospel and the mission of portraying the gospel, the mission of making the gospel beautiful, is more important than anything that's convenient for me. And that the mission of making the gospel beautiful should govern and inform how we make all of our decisions.